Amy, you're muted.
There we go. Thank you, Cynthia, and thanks to everybody for coming to my webinar today. I'm going to get right to it. Okay. Tonight, I am going to sing the praises of native plants, but first, I have a confession to make. 5 years ago, I didn't care at all for Northwest native plants. I thought they were ugly and boring, and I didn't understand why any gardener would want to plant them when we have so many other prettier plants we can grow here from all over the world. I didn't think native plants were important for wildlife. I saw bees and birds in my garden. I figured my exotic plants were giving them everything they needed. Besides, if some wildlife did rely on native plants, well, that's what nature's for, right? My garden was for me, for my own pleasure. And then, in December of 2020, I read Doug Tallamy's book, Nature's Best Hope, and it completely changed my worldview. It completely changed my opinion of native plants and their importance in gardens. Now, there are 4 statistics in the book that were key to changing my mind, and they had to do with caterpillars. The first statistic, 96% of terrestrial birds in North America feed their chicks insects rather than seeds or berries. And the insects they choose are primarily caterpillars. In our backyards, doves and finches can get by on seeds, but pretty much all other birds need caterpillars. The second statistic, well, how many caterpillars do birds need? The answer, thousands. For example, in one study, over a span of 16 days, one pair of Carolina chickadee parents, on average, brought their offspring 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars. The third statistic, around 90% of leaf-eating insects, such as caterpillars, are specialists, meaning they can only eat plants belonging to 3 or fewer families. Now, do they have to be native plants in those families? Well, not always, but most of the time, yes. Insects have to eat the plants that they've evolved with. The fourth statistic. Well, can't the insects just live in nature, in wild areas, and leave our gardens alone? Well, no, because 95% of the country has been logged, tilled, drained, grazed, paved, or otherwise developed. There just isn't enough pristine nature left out there for wildlife. We have to make our developed areas more amenable to wildlife, in particular to insects, if we want to support the food webs that sustain life on our planet. So, armed with this information, I was raring to go. I was ready to renovate my garden and plant natives. But not just any natives, because some native plants don't do much for wildlife at all. For example, sword fern. Nothing eats it. It doesn't have flowers. I think of sword fern as the iceberg lettuce of the landscape. Now, it's not bad to eat iceberg lettuce, but it's really not very nutritious. There are better options. Sword ferns are not bad plants to have in the landscape, but there are better options for sustaining wildlife. Doug Tallamy calls the best of these options keystone plants. You can find a list of the keystone plants for your area by going to the National Wildlife Federation's Native Plant Finder website and entering your zip code. The plants are listed according to the number of species of caterpillars they support. So let me show you what that list looks like for the Portland area. I'll just run through the top 6. Number 1 on this list is salix, our native willows. They support 312 species of caterpillars here, and there are quite a few locally native species of willow to choose from. Number 2 is prunus, our native cherries, which includes choke cherry and bitter cherry. Number 3 is populus, our native aspens and cottonwoods, which includes quaking aspen and black cottonwood. Number 4 is alnus, our native alders, which includes red alder and white alder. Number 5 is Gary oak, and number 6 is ponderosa pine. So again, you can find this list by going to that website, and the easiest way to find it is just to enter NWF Native Plant Finder in your search bar, and then you'll enter your zip code, and you'll get a list of both woody plants and herbaceous plants that support the most caterpillars. So that covers caterpillars. But pollinators are also very important. And for pollinator plants, I found 4 lists to be especially helpful for my garden here in Portland. I encourage you to check out these lists from the Pollinator Partnership, from OSU, from the West Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District, and from the Xerces Society. And so, over the past 4 years, I've torn out a lot of the plants from my garden that don't feed anybody, and I've replaced them with plants that do, including many of the plants from these lists. And then I've walked the garden, I've taken thousands of photos, and I've been blown away. I've been blown away by the diversity of insects I found in my garden. In just the past few years, I've observed about 40 bee species, 50 wasp species, 90 fly species. I would love to do a whole talk just on flies. I don't know if the world is ready for that, but man, the diversity of flies in your garden is incredible. You have no idea. I've seen about 40 moth and butterfly species so far, about 50 bug species, these are true bugs, and about 50 beetle species, among others. So tonight, I want to show you some of the coolest species I've seen. I want to take you on a whirlwind tour of my garden, starting in February with manzanita. Now, technically, the manzanitas in my garden aren't locally native species. They're hybrids, but they are wonderful wildlife plants. They flower in late winter when the bumblebee queens are just emerging from hibernation. Now, I don't know if you've seen the bumblebees when they first emerge. They're doing it right now, but they're huge and loud, and they seem very aggressive. They'll fly around your head and buzz really loud, but it's only for show. They don't want to sting you. They're just hungry. They haven't eaten in months. And manzanita flowers provide a great source of nourishment for them, both nectar and pollen. Now, the yellow-faced bumblebee is the most common bumblebee in my garden by far, and probably yours as well. It's also the first to emerge, along with the black-tailed bumblebee, which in our area has an orange belt around its big belly. I've also seen this imposter on manzanita. It looks like a bumblebee, but it's actually a fly. It's a bumblefly. Bumbleflies lay their eggs in rotting wood, and the larvae eat the decaying organic matter they find there, but the adults visit flowers. And incidentally, I think flies probably do a lot more pollinating than we give them credit for. Willows bloom in March, typically, and they're a valuable food source for native bees. Female plants offer nectar, and male plants offer both nectar and pollen. Now, I chose a schooler willow for my garden because it's an upland willow. That means it requires a lot less water than your typical willow. Now, my willow is a male, and that was good news to me because that means I'll have pollen for my pollinators as well as nectar. Now, you can see the yellow pollen on the flowers, and that's how you know it's a male. This is what the female flowers look like on willow. Now, these flowers don't have any pollen, just nectar, but nectar is very valuable in March because there isn't much else that's blooming right now. You may remember that willow is also the #1 food source for caterpillars in our area, and sure enough, not long after I planted it, I watched a western tiger swallowtail butterfly lay 3 eggs on my willow. This was a couple years ago, and this was in July. Now, I do want my caterpillars to be bird food, but I just didn't have the heart to let my first 3 babies be sacrificial victims. So I took the eggs indoors and I raised the caterpillars on willow leaves. In August, they all went into chrysalis. Now, this is interesting. The first caterpillar made its chrysalis on the branch that I gave it, and it matched its chrysalis to the branch almost exactly. I mean, right down to having some fake green lichen on the chrysalis. And I thought it was just a coincidence because, I mean, how could they do this on purpose? But then the second caterpillar made its chrysalis on the black plastic tray it was in, and its chrysalis was nearly black. So is that a coincidence? I have no idea. There are so many of these little mysteries that I'm finding in my garden now that I'm paying attention to the insects. In any case, they didn't emerge in the fall, so I put them in the fridge for the winter. The next spring in early May, I took them out of the fridge, and a few weeks later, this happened. The first one emerged, and then the second, and then the third, and they were perfect. Now, in the wild, Western tiger swallowtails usually come out in late May, around the same time our native mock orange is blooming, Philadelphus lewisii. And that's a good place to look for them. This is Table Mountain meadowfoam, Limnanthes douglasii subspecies nivea. It's an annual. It's native to southern Oregon and California. It blooms in April, and it's very attractive to many early emerging bees, such as this mason bee. Now, this is a blue orchard bee. It's a type of mason bee. And this is a male who's just emerged from his cocoon. And you can tell it's a male because he has a white mustache. The males are also smaller than the females, and they have longer antennae, which is pretty typical for most bees. Now, female blue orchard bees will nest in old beetle burrows or hollow reeds or mason bee houses if you put them out for them. Now, they use mud to make the partitions of their nest. So if you do put a mason bee house out, be sure to have some mud available for them to use. So one year, I put a house out, and it was a lot of fun watching the bees make their nests and cap them off with mud. However, when I opened up my house in the fall, it was a travesty. There were dead bees and parasites everywhere. So it turns out you should really take your house in around June 1st to protect the bees from these parasites. You can just put them in a brown paper grocery bag and seal it up and store it in the garage or a warm place for the summer. You should also clean the house in the fall, and you should also clean the cocoons and store them in the fridge for the winter for best success. Now, if you don't know how to do all this, there's an excellent guide from OSU that will teach you everything you need to know. It's called Nurturing Mason Bees in Your Backyard in Western Oregon. Poached eggplant, Limnanthes douglasii, blooms a few weeks later. It also attracts lots of native bees, such as this mining bee. Now, mining bees, along with 70% of our native bees, nest in bare ground. So be sure to leave some bare ground in your garden for them. Don't go and mulch every square inch of it. Case in point, I have these tiny black bees nesting in bare soil in my garden. Now, these are small sweat bees. They're called sweat bees because they have a habit of landing on people and sipping their sweat. And sure enough, when I sit by their nests in the summer and I watch them work, they land on my bare arms and legs. Now, they've never stung me, and it really just kind of tickles a little bit. Some bees nest in aggregations. Now, the small sweat bees in my garden occupy only a few square feet of space, but there are dozens of nests in here. Can you see some of those in this photo? So let me help you out a little bit. There's a dozen of them. And so I have to be careful not to dig around in this bed too much because I don't want to disturb the bees inside. It kind of reminds me of a Brad Pitt movie from the 90s that I saw called 7 Years in Tibet. It was a pretty bad movie, but I've always remembered this one scene where Brad Pitt's character was helping the villagers clear out some land for a building, and the villagers were freaking out because they were killing earthworms. They were Buddhists, and they believed that the earthworms could be their ancestors who were reincarnated as worms. And I always thought that scene was so silly. But now that I have a sense of how much life is in the soil in my garden, I kind of get it. I mean, I don't believe in reincarnation, but I do have a much greater appreciation for all of the life forms in my garden now, and I try to disturb them as little as possible. Okay, strawberries. I'm starting to use native strawberries as ground cover all over the garden. They are wonderful plants. They bloom in April and May, and they attract tons of tiny bees, especially these little mining bees who pollinate the flowers, and they help produce the tiny strawberries. However, the main reason I wanted to grow native strawberries in my garden was because they rank so highly on that list I told you about from the National Wildlife Federation. They're number 1 on the list for herbaceous plants. They support 69 species of caterpillars here. Now, I haven't seen many caterpillars on my strawberry plants just yet, but one day I did see an unexpected insect chewing on the leaves of my woodland strawberry? It was a bee. Why would a bee chew on strawberry leaves? Well, this is another kind of mason bee. Some mason bees don't use mud to make the partitions of their nest. They use these little bits of chewed up leaf. So this mother came back again and again to the same plant to gather these little bits of chewed up leaf. And I swear, if I hadn't caught her in the act, I never would have guessed who was making those chew marks. Ceanothus, also known as California lilac, is a powerhouse plant for pollinators. My largest Ceanothus is a hybrid, Victoria, and at its peak in May, I'll see at least a couple dozen bumblebees on it at a time, along with many other pollinators. Ceanothus also feeds caterpillars. And one day I found this group of 16 caterpillars all feeding together on my Victoria. So I did some research and found out they were California tortoiseshell butterflies. So California tortoiseshells are kind of interesting because they're known for having these huge population explosions every once in a while. For example, in 2004, there was a swarm of these butterflies seen in California that was 15 miles wide and 40 to 50 miles long. Ceanothus supports 93 species of caterpillars in all, and I think that's what the bush tits are after when they're in my Victoria. I often see them hopping on the branches. Now, California poppies are native annuals that reseed in my garden, and I'm really happy about that. The flowers don't have any nectar, but they have lots of pollen and lots of native bees. Love them for that. All kinds of smaller bees visit the flowers, like this furrow bee. This is a type of sweat bee. And mining bees come to gather the pollen from my California poppies. Just look at that sweet little face. And bumblebees are especially fond of the flowers. I really love how they plop down in the middle of the flower and they spin around in a circle to gather up all the pollen. Now, I often hear the bumblebees before I see them because they like to buzz pollinate these flowers. Buzz pollination is when the bee grabs onto the flower parts and she vibrates her flight muscles, and that shakes the pollen loose from the anthers. Now, it makes a high-pitched buzzing sound when she does this. It sounds like the bee is playing a tiny kazoo. It's like zzz, zzz. And once I learned to recognize that sound, I realized the bumblebees were buzz pollinating many different flowers in my garden, such as that Ceanothus. Pacific waterleaf, Hydrophyllum tenuipes, is a native wildflower that does like some shade, which is nice because a lot of these pollinator plants do prefer full sun. Waterleaf is an extraordinary pollinator plant. It's a very important plant in my garden because it blooms in May when I have a lot of hungry bees in my garden, especially bumblebees. Now, several species of bumblebee visit my waterleaf flowers. There's the yellow-faced bumblebee, which again is my most common bumblebee. Then there's the California bumblebee, which looks a lot like the yellow-faced bumblebee, but it has a black face. The fuzzy-horned bumblebee has an orange butt, not to be confused with the black-tailed bumblebee, which has a black butt and an orange bill. The yellow-fronted bumblebee is a rather nondescript looking bumblebee, but I love them just the same. Lots of smaller bees visit my waterleaf flowers too, and they visit for both pollen and nectar. Now, it's pretty obvious when they're collecting pollen because the anthers of the flowers stick out so far. Tiny bees will curl their whole body around a single anther to collect the pollen. On the other hand, when bees want nectar, you'll notice they ignore the anthers and they drink from deep at the base of the flower where the nectar is located. Now, waterleaf is a ground cover and it does spread steadily, especially in moist soil. So you want to put it in a place where it can run, or you can try to keep it somewhat contained like I do. I have lots of plants growing around it to help keep it in check. And also, I don't water it a whole lot. Now, waterleaf does go dormant in the summer after it sets seed. So just be aware that you're going to have a gap in the garden then. So what I do is early in the year, I'll cut away the sword ferns around it and to give the water leaf room to grow. And then as the water leaf disappears, the ferns will just fill back in. So see, I do have some sword ferns in my garden. Now this pretty wildflower is rose checker mallow, Sedelcia malviflora subspecies virgata. It's a perennial. It attracts a fair amount of pollinators, but my favorite ones are the green metallic sweat bees. I've seen two species of green metallic sweat bee in my garden. There's the bicolored striped sweat bee, which is always striped. And there's the fine striped sweat bee, which is striped when it's male, but the females are solid green like this one. Now, these are gorgeous bees, and they're more common than you might think. You just have to look for them. They visit many different flowers throughout the season, like this coreopsis, but it seems like rose checker mallow is the first one that I see them on in my garden in May. Native lupins are a valuable source of pollen for native bees. The pollen on lupins, by the way, is orange. You can see it packed onto her pollen basket on her back leg there. It's usually pretty obvious when bees are collecting lupin pollen. Now, it's mostly bumblebees that visit lupins because the insect has to be fairly strong to be able to open up the flower and access that pollen inside. Now, here's a smaller bee, a mason bee, who did manage to squeeze her way into the flowers of my riverbank lupin. Now, lupins support 55 species of caterpillars in our area. Like this caterpillar I saw hiding among the buds of one of my lupins one day. Now, later I saw this same species of caterpillar on another plant, but I noticed it didn't move like a caterpillar, kind of lurched around like a hand searching for a light switch in the dark. And what was it doing? It was hunting and eating aphids. So, what kind of caterpillar eats aphids? I mean, they're vegetarians, right? Well, this wasn't a caterpillar at all. This was the larva of an aphid eating hoverfly. This is a baby fly. It would eventually become this beautiful creature, the white-bowed smoothwing. Now, since I've been looking for them, I've seen several other species of aphid-eating hoverflies in my garden, such as the forked globetail, the western calligrapher, the oblique streaktail, the common loopwing aphid eater, the large-tailed aphid eater, the black-margined flower fly, and the diamond spot-tail. The moral of the story is you don't need to spray your aphids. They're food for all of these creatures and many, many more. If you do have an aphid infestation, just be patient, and these beneficial creatures will almost always take care of the problem for you. Raspberry flowers are a favorite of native bees, but raspberries have additional wildlife appeal. They're host to 96 species of caterpillars in our area, and as a result, I often see certain wasps patrolling my raspberries for caterpillars, like this potter wasp. So she'll catch a caterpillar, she'll sting it and paralyze it, and she'll take it back to her nest to feed her offspring. She'll lay her eggs on it. This is what her nest looks like. They call them potter wasps for a reason. They make these nests out of mud that look like little clay jugs. And I've never found one in my garden, but I would love to see one. This is just a photo I got off the internet. The cut stems of raspberry serve as prime nesting sites for small carpenter bees. So one year, I bundled some of these raspberry canes to make some small carpenter bee hotels, and I hung them up under my patio awning. The bees loved them. The mothers dug tunnels into those pithy stems, and they laid their eggs inside. Now, the problem with these insect hotels, however, is that gathering the insects together in one spot makes it easy for predators and parasites to find them. And this is a teeny, tiny, tiny little parasitoid wasp that targets these small carpenter bees. And I think it was pretty happy to have found my hotels. So here's a better thing to do. When you cut your raspberries back in late winter and your perennials in general, or any of your perennials with really strong, sturdy stems, just leave the stems about 12 or 15 inches long when you cut them, and the bees will use them right in place. Now, this is an important point that a lot of people don't understand. The stems need to be cut so the bees can get in there. Most insects can't burrow into an intact stem. They need that access point. So this is what my raspberry canes look like after I do this. And when you see those perfect round holes in the end, you know that the bees have found them. They've chewed their way in. So at this point, you just want to leave the stems alone and you don't cut them again. You just let the bees do their thing. Now, speaking of wasps that target small carpenter bees, here's another one. This is Grotia californica. I don't believe it has a common name, but I call it the flying IUD. It's copper colored and it flies around with its antennae pointing straight out like the prongs of an IUD. It flies around these twiggy plants, such as raspberries, looking for these small carpenter bee nests to lay its eggs in. So the one on the right, the picture on the right, that is a female, and you know it because she has an ovipositor at the end of her abdomen. That is not a stinger. It's for laying her eggs, and she'll use that to drill right through the stems to do that. All right, this fierce-looking insect that I found on my raspberries one day is a raspberry crown borer. So predators think it's a yellow jacket and they leave it alone, but it's really just a harmless moth. Doesn't bite or sting or anything. Now, I suppose raspberry farmers wouldn't consider it harmless because, after all, it does lay its eggs on raspberry plants. But I think it's amazing, and I'm more than happy to share my raspberries with it. And I have plenty of raspberries to eat. You would never even know this insect was there so far. Phacelia heterophylla is a native perennial. It's short-lived, but it does reseed pretty reliably, so it acts like a perennial anyway. When it blooms in late May and June, it is the best bumblebee attractor in my whole garden. The flowers are kind of small and dingy white. It's not super showy, but it is the best bumblebee attractor. And in fact, this plant attracts tons of other native bees. It's one of the best overall bee plants you can have in your garden. Now, another interesting insect I see all over my phacelia in the summer is this funny little native stink bug. It's called the hedge nettle stink bug. It's also known as the happy bespectacled stink bug because it looks like it's smiling and wearing orange-rimmed glasses. This is another native stink bug I found on my Phacelia heterophylla a few times. It's called the twice-stabbed stink bug because it looks like it has two bloody stab wounds. I think somebody really had fun naming these guys. Native roses are a must-have for the wildlife-friendly garden. Now, the flowers don't have any nectar, just like California poppies, but they've got loads of pollen, and all kinds of bees come to collect it, like these bees on my Nootka rose. Now, this is one flower, and you can see there's 4 little bees on it collecting the pollen, and that's not unusual. The bumblebees will also storm in, and they'll buzz pollinate the flowers. Our roses also attract aphids, which is probably why I found this ladybug larva on my Nootka rose one day. Now, I believe this is the larva of our native western polished ladybug. As an adult, it's a very small ladybug. It's dark red, doesn't have any spots. It does have these white rings around its fake eye spots. I think it's a little cutie pie, and I'm always happy to find it in the garden. Now, I was sad to learn that my most common ladybug by far, the 7-spot ladybug, isn't native, it's European. Now, we do have quite a few native ladybug species here in the Northwest, and they have all different sorts of colors and patterns. Some of them you wouldn't even recognize as ladybugs, but I don't see those natives very often. And partly I think that's because a lot of them are really, really small. But also, I think some of these exotic species are probably outcompeting our natives for resources, and they're helping to make them rare. Now, this is a ladybug that is native to the Pacific Northwest. It's called the 20 spot ladybug. This is a teeny tiny little ladybug, and it doesn't eat aphids. This one eats powdery mildew. Now, I doubt it eats enough mildew to really make a big difference in your plants, but it's something to think about before you go spraying your plants. Ocean spray, Holodiscus discolor. This is a large native shrub. It can get 10, 15 feet tall. It's an upright grower, and you can train it to be tree-like, although it never really becomes a tree per se. It's pretty shrubby. Ocean spray grows fast. That was the first thing that struck me about this plant when I first started growing it a few years ago. It does not waste any time. It's also incredibly drought tolerant, especially if you give it a little bit of shade. Ocean spray blooms in June in my garden. Now, it doesn't bloom a long time, only about 2 or 3 weeks. But man, when it does bloom, it is covered in insects. Lots of mining bees visit the flowers, and they visit for both nectar and pollen. The pollen is creamy white on ocean spray, and you can see it packed onto her back leg there. She's going to take that pollen back to her nest, and she'll feed her babies with it. This is another mining bee. This one's drinking nectar from my ocean spray. This one looks like a male because he's got skinny legs, because the males don't carry pollen, just the females. Mason bees visit my ocean spray. They collect pollen on their bellies instead of their legs. Here's a resin bee on my ocean spray, and another photo of one on my yarrow. They also carry pollen on their bellies. You can kind of see it in the photo on the right there. They also collect plant resins to make their nest cells with, hence the name. Bumblebees visit my ocean spray. Now, they often scurry real fast over the surface of the flowers to collect the pollen, and this is called scrabbling. Other insects visit my ocean spray too. This is a longhorn flower beetle on my ocean spray. That's a male there. And I believe this is a female of the same species on goldenrod later on in the year. Now, these beetles lay their eggs on dead or dying trees, especially conifers and oaks, and the larvae eat the decaying wood. But the adults visit flowers, and they eat pollen for nourishment. Now, before I paid attention to the insects in my garden, I never even knew these beetles existed, but now I see them every year. It's like seeing old friends, and I think they're beautiful. This is a leafhopper assassin bug. They like to hang out on any kind of plant that has a lot of insect activity, such as ocean spray when it's blooming. They really are assassins. They're predators, and they don't single out leafhoppers. They attack all sorts of insects. I often see them eating bees, like this one, which is kind of sad, but I mean, that's just nature. Nature is a big restaurant. Ocean spray is also a host plant to 39 species of moths and butterflies in our area. Now, one I haven't seen yet, but I'll be looking for, is the ocean spray fairy longhorn moth. Now, this is just a tiny little moth. It's only like 1/4 of an inch long, but look at those antennae. So the mothers lay their eggs on the buds of ocean spray and only ocean spray. And by the way, almost half of all caterpillar species eat only one plant genus. So if you want one of those moths or butterflies to breed in your garden, you have to have that genus. It's just like monarchs and milkweed. Showy tarweed, Madia elegans, is an annual wildflower. It's native to Oregon and California. Blooms in the summertime, and it's making quite a show here. This was in my garden a couple summers ago. But honestly, I have to say, I find this plant a little bit disappointing because the flowers close up by 8:15 a.m. At least in my garden, at least when it's sunny out, which it always is in the summertime here in Portland. Yeah, you really have to be a morning person to appreciate this one. But there are some early morning pollinators that really do love it. Those beautiful green metallic sweat bees really like it a lot. And the longhorn bees are also very fond of it. So the female longhorn bees will collect the pollen from this plant and other aster family plants. They're specialists on aster family plants. And they pack that pollen onto their rear legs until they look like they're wearing fluffy yellow leg warmers. Male longhorn bees have really long antennae, which is why they're called longhorn bees. The males are also known for having slumber parties. They often gather together to sleep at the same spot every night. Now, my friend Greg found this longhorn bee slumber party in his garden on his mattia, and I thought it was the cutest thing. Now, you'll notice the male longhorn bees have white mustaches, just like the male mason bees. I grow our native annual Clarkia amina. It's also known as farewell to spring because it blooms in early summer, just as we're saying farewell to spring. The leafcutter bees love it to pieces, literally. So this is a female leafcutter bee, and she's stealing pieces of the petals. She'll take those back to her nest, and she'll use them to make her nest cells. And then she'll put a ball of pollen in each cell, and then she'll lay a single egg on each pollen ball. And then when her eggs are all laid, her duties are done, she'll die, and she'll never meet her children, who will emerge the following year and repeat the process. Now, the leafcutter bees also take petals from another Clarkia I grow, Clarkia purpurea. This is also an annual. It has pretty small flowers. It's really not super showy, but it also blooms a couple weeks before the Clarkia amina. And the leafcutter bees really like this one too. Here you can see the whole cutting process in some more detail. Now this happens really fast, so I was fortunate to get some good photos of it. But you can see how she grabs onto the piece she's going to take, and then she just cuts all around with her sharp mandibles. And then she carries it away. There's an excellent book by Joe Wilson and Olivia Carroll. It's entitled The Bees in Your Backyard. And in this book, the authors compare this cutting process to a cartoon character sawing a hole in the floor around herself, which I think is pretty accurate. Now, several years ago, I put a bunch of short bamboo stakes around the garden as hose guides. And one year, I found some leafcutter bees using those as nesting sites. So here's one using orange petals to cap off her nest. Now, I couldn't figure out where she was getting these orange petals because I didn't really have any flowers in the garden that were that shade of orange. So I looked around and I looked around, and then I realized she was still using Clarkia. So at this point, she had used up all the pink petals. They were just shreds. And so she started using the leaves, and the leaves were turning orange because the plants were dying back. It's just an annual. She was determined she was going to use that plant one way or another. So I went back to the same nest an hour later, and I noticed it had been broken into. And then I saw a leafcutter bee come in for a landing, and she crawled into the nest, and she forced out another leafcutter bee that was already inside. So some of these leafcutter bees will fight over nesting sites. So that inspired me to have a lot more bamboo hose guides in my garden, and just bamboo plant stakes, or just bamboo in general. Now, if you want to do this too, you should be aware that imported bamboo from China is often treated with fungicides, and fungicides are bad for bees. So be sure to just use untreated bamboo. And you can often get it for free off Craigslist, like I did. I've also seen leafcutter bees, or evidence of their presence, on other native plants in my garden, such as my Nootka rose, my raspberries, my snowberries, and even California poppy flowers. Hummingbirds also visit my Clarkia flowers, and when they go to seed, the goldfinches will feast on the seed. One day I looked out and I noticed 15 goldfinches at one time on my little patch of Clarkia eating the seeds, and the patch was only about 4 feet wide. I grow our native goldenrod, uh, Solidago elongata, which blooms in July, along with some non-native selections of goldenrod from the eastern states that I really love, such as Golden Baby, Little Lemon, and Fireworks. Now, out of all my plants, I get probably my greatest diversity of insects on my goldenrods. One of my favorite insects I see on goldenrod pretty regularly is the American sand wasp. Now, the females hunt flies to feed their offspring, and the males, well, they just sit around and look pretty. I have to say, when I started gardening for wildlife, I never imagined I would fall in love with wasps, but I have fallen for them pretty hard. They are gorgeous, and the vast majority of them are not aggressive at all. In fact, only 1.5% of our wasps are the aggressive social wasps. The rest are solitary wasps like this one, and they're actually very timid around people. Chris Helzer has a wonderful blog called The Prairie Ecologist, and in one of his blog posts, he put it like this: dismissing all wasps because of a few aggressive ones is kind of like giving up on Mexican food because you don't like cilantro. I couldn't agree more. Mexican food is certainly more than just cilantro, and wasps are certainly more than just yellow jackets. Now, by the way, the wasp in this photo is not a yellow jacket. This is a yellow-legged mud dauber wasp. She looks terrifying, but she's very gentle. She's just collecting mud here to make her nest with. So I put out a tray of mud for her, and she comes and she digs these tiny balls of mud, and she hums while she does it. It's adorable. And then she tucks it under her chin, and she flies away with it. It's really entertaining to watch. Here's some more wasps that I see on goldenrod pretty regularly. Philanthus. The common name for this genus is bee wolf because the mothers hunt bees to feed their kids. The grass-carrying wasps. These mothers hunt tree crickets and katydids, and they'll sting them, paralyze them, take them back to their nest, which is in some sort of crevice. And then they'll stuff them in there, they'll lay their eggs on them, and then they'll stuff these dried grass blades into the opening. This all-black species here is the Mexican grass-carrying wasp. It's very common. You'll see it on many different flowers all throughout the season. This species is less common. It's called the elegant grass-carrying wasp, and I do think it is quite elegant. This one's on Fireworks goldenrod, which doesn't bloom until September. These little jewels are cuckoo wasps. Now, cuckoo wasps, like cuckoo birds, don't make their own nests. They sneak into other mothers' nests and lay their eggs. These green cuckoo wasps are very shy. They're very hard to photograph. The one on the right happened to fall in my bird bath and just took a minute to dry off its wings. So those are cuckoo wasps. There are also cuckoo bees, such as Triopiolus, the longhorn cuckoo bees. So they lay their eggs in the nests of, you guessed it, longhorn bees, which nest in the ground. Now, these are little bees with these bright zebra stripes, and they also have another interesting ID feature. They have a smiley face emoji on their backs. Pearly Everlasting is a native perennial in the aster family, and it's one of the few members of the aster family that's dioecious, which means the male flowers and the female flowers are on separate plants, just like willow. Now, only the males have pollen, but both genders have nectar, and all sorts of insects will visit this plant for nectar and or pollen in July and August when it blooms. Lots of bees come to fuel up, such as small carpenter bees, longhorn bees, and leafcutter bees. All sorts of interesting wasps visit my Pearly Everlasting too, such as Cerceris, the weevil wasps. These mothers hunt weevils and other beetles to feed their offspring. Spider wasps visit. These mothers hunt, you guessed it, spiders to feed their kids. Now, these are all solitary wasps. They're not aggressive towards people at all. Look at this weirdo. This is a plume moth on my pearly everlasting. Now, I don't know what species this is or what it lays its eggs on, but frankly, I don't care. I think it's cool. I'm happy to have it in the garden, and I'm happy to share whatever plants it wants to eat. This is a strawberry crown moth. Now, besides strawberries, the larvae also feed on roses, raspberries, and potentilla. So I suppose some people would consider it a pest of those plants, but not me. I'm just happy to have these moths in the garden, and they can eat whatever they want. I grow lots of asters, both native and non-native asters. Two of the West Coast natives that I grow are Pacific aster and Douglas aster. When they bloom in late summer and fall, I see tons of cool insects on them. In fact, in a recent study at OSU of 23 pollinator plants, Douglas aster was the overall winner in both native bee abundance and diversity. I also see lots of cool flies on my asters, such as this hornet fly. Now, you'd swear this was a yellow jacket if you didn't know any better. Its eyes are even striped to make it look more like a yellow jacket, but it's just a harmless fly. Doesn't sting or bite or anything. Now, I've seen quite a few hornet flies in my garden since I've been looking for them, and I get a kick out of them every time. They are so funny. You know, when I started gardening for wildlife, I never imagined I would fall in love with wasps, but I really didn't think I'd fall in love with flies, but here we are. This pretty little hoverfly is the narrow-headed marsh fly. It's got these vertical stripes on its thorax, which makes it look like it's wearing a little soccer jersey, which I thought was an original observation on my part. But then I found out there's a related species in the UK, and they thought the same thing. But of course, they don't call it the soccer player, they call it the footballer. One cute fuzzy fly I've seen on my asters and elsewhere is this bee fly in the genus Villa. Now, before I started paying attention to the insects in my garden, I never even knew this fly existed. But once I started recognizing it, I started seeing it quite a lot. It's pretty common. So one day I tried to look up some more information on it, and I could hardly find anything at all. And unfortunately, that's the case for a lot of our backyard insects. Even though they're literally in our backyards, a lot of them just haven't been studied very much, and we don't know much about them. Which brings me to my final insect. So for a few days, I had this spotted wool carder bee hanging around my Pacific aster. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the Oregon Bee Atlas, but since 2018, volunteers for the Oregon Bee Atlas have been trying to catalog every bee species that lives here. They've collected thousands of specimens, hundreds of thousands of specimens. And out of all of those specimens, they have only collected the spotted wool carder bee one time. And that was way down by the California state line, not anywhere near Portland. And I think that goes to show that when you garden for wildlife and you pay attention, not only can you see cool insects, but you could also make a discovery that's of some value to science. I mean, you could extend the range of a species like I did, or you could observe a new behavior for a species, or heck, you could even discover a brand new species. It happens all the time. However, you don't have to discover a brand new species in order to appreciate how gratifying gardening for wildlife can be. Every day, I make little discoveries like this longhorn bee slumber party that I discovered in my own garden. Every day, I see something new, or at least something interesting. My garden is full of life and action, and I find it endlessly fascinating. I want to leave you with a quote from my favorite gardening book of all time. It's A New Garden Ethic by Benjamin Vogt. And in this book, Vogt talks about how we've forgotten how to speak the language of nature, a language that, with any luck at all, we knew how to speak as children. He says, one way to learn that language again is to explore the remnants of wildness around us in prairies and woodlands and deserts and fens. Another way is to bring that wildness home and to see how much more wildness is waiting at the margins of our lives to flow into the very heart of our daily being. It really is incredible how many amazing creatures show up when you put out the welcome mat for them. When you plant native plants, the right native plants, and provide some habitat. I do hope I've inspired you to grow some of these plants in your own garden, to bring that wildness home and to experience it for yourself. Thank you. All right, I am happy to take questions. I haven't been looking at the chat.
That's all right. I'm going to look at the questions, and we do have a bunch of questions for you. First question was from Ellen, and she wanted to know if you had a recommended guidebook or app to begin identify some of the pollinators.
Sure. For a book, Merrill Peterson's Pacific, I think it's called Pacific Northwest Insects, is a great guidebook. I would also recommend getting on iNaturalist. It's a citizen science website, and you can just post photos of any living thing, and the image recognition software that's built into it has gotten to be really good, and it can often maybe not give you the species of the organism you're posting, but can often give you the genus, or at least get you in the right direction. And then human experts will often weigh in and either confirm that ID or give you another suggestion. It's been incredibly
great.
helpful.
I recently had a cicada. I'd seen one last year in my yard, and I had a professional on cicadas who confirmed my identification. Very exciting.
Mm-hmm.
And then how far do native bees fly in search of food? Vicky wonders.
Bumblebees will go the farthest. Generally, the larger the bee, the farther it will travel. I think they can go like maybe a mile or two.
Wow.
But the little tiny bees, like the small carpenter bees, will often only travel like 1 or 2 football fields, like a couple 100 yards, their whole lives. So they're very, very local.
She also is wondering, how big is your garden, and what type of camera do you use to post these, to get these great shots?
My garden is a little bit bigger than the average Portland City lot, but it's still not huge. It's almost 7,000 square feet.
And that includes your house, so it's
Yeah,
not all garden.
yeah.
Yeah.
And the camera I use, it's not fancy. It's a Canon Rebel T7. I don't have a macro lens. I don't have a zoom lens. I don't use a flash, and I don't use a tripod. I'm just
Wow.
really stealthy.
Boy.
I've learned how to approach the insects. I take a
Mhm.
lot of photos. I have a lot of bad photos. I weed out the good ones and I crop them. I maybe sharpen up the focus a little bit. If you'll look really closely, you'll notice they're not perfect. They could be a lot better.
I think
But
they're wonderful.
they're yeah, I'm not humble bragging or anything.
No?
They're good for my purposes, and
Mhm.
they're great for presentations on a screen.
They are. Let's see. Someone says that was excellent. Thank you, Amy. Maria, excuse me, says, for a small spot in the yard, what would you suggest for flowering plants?
For a small, you could do like like a shrub and maybe limb it up and then have some flowering plants underneath. Yeah, you have to get a little creative because a lot of these native plants tend to sucker, at least the shrubs do. Um, then they want to kind of take over the universe.
Yep.
But yeah, you have to be strategic about it, but there's all different sizes of plants. And you know, situations
Yep.
where you can
Then
use those.
Ellen says, I'm hosting Mason Bees for the first, excuse me, for the first time this year. Is there any concern about insect competition or territorial behaviors?
No, not that I know of. Um, the bees all get along just fine. Um, there shouldn't be any problem with that.
And
Just
then,
be sure to have lots of flowers for them available. And they will, go to your neighbor's yard and check that out too. So hopefully there's enough in the neighborhood to keep everybody well fed.
they're not like the scrub jays. Boy, are they the ones that'll chase off just about anything.
Yeah.
And Jennifer asks, she said, I appreciate the tips on how to create space for insects, leaving raspberry canes, but leaving raspberry canes cut off is a great takeaway. Thank you, she said. And Vicky wonders, do you see honeybees in your yard?
Do I see honeybees?
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, honeybees are everywhere. Yeah, I kind of consider them a nuisance. They're not native and they can potentially compete with our native bees and they can potentially spread diseases to our native bees. It's really not recommended to raise honeybee hive or have honeybee hives where there isn't enough resources for them. You really want to be careful about that. But yeah, they're everywhere. They're completely entrenched. So yeah.
They are. And somebody says they've got a large voluntary hive in a hollow of their tree. So let's see. I've got some people putting some things in the chat. I think we answered all the questions here. I do just want to mention that we did have, oh, wait a sec. Let's check here. Well, looks like we got them. I do want to mention that we did have some problems with the PDF, and when we send out the link to our YouTube recording of this, we will include a better link to the PDF. I'm not sure what happened, but some people were having trouble opening that. Amy has posted her website here. There's lots to see on that. She's also on Instagram. And you can find her on iNaturalist and occasionally at Garden Fever.
That's right.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time, Amy, and appreciate all of you in attendance. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for having me. And I'm happy to answer any other questions people have later on via email or yeah.
All right.